cedar bark, woven tight, still whole after centuries in wet clay. A storm tore open a bank on the Washington coast and uncovered part of a Makah village the mud had swallowed long ago. Out of that clay came the everyday things a life is made of, the woven, the carved, the first things time usually erases. The mud had kept them, but survival is only half of keeping. This is Ozette, on Cape Alava, the far northwest corner of Washington state. For generations, it was a Makah village on the outer coast. The Makah Cultural and Research Center records a Makah oral history of a great slide that buried part of that village. Then, in the winter of 1969 and 1970, a storm cut into the bank and brought the buried past back to the surface. What followed was not a weekend dig. It was an 11-year recovery, carried out with Makah participation, that lifted more than 55,000 objects out of the ground. But hold on to the strange part. What came out of that clay was the ordinary texture of a life: baskets, cordage, worked wood. And it was lying there, mute, waiting for someone to say what it had been. Think about what a village actually is underneath the word. Not a ruin, not a monument. A place where people did the same small things every day. At Ozette, that daily life was built from wood, from cedar bark, from plant fiber and cordage, the soft working materials of a coast. Nets and mats and boxes and handles, the things a hand reaches for without thinking. The Makah Cultural and Research Center keeps a record of a Makah oral history, the memory of a great slide that came down over part of the village. That is a documented tradition, attributed to the Makah, set beside the physical layer of clay the archaeology later confirmed. Not a full script of what happened, but a meeting point. A people's memory of a slide, and a real slide layer, describing the same buried place. And under that clay was not treasure in the usual sense. It was the everyday, which is exactly the problem. The grand things of any culture get carved in stone, written down, painted, remembered on purpose. The everyday almost never survives. It lives in hands and in habit, and when the people who used it are gone, it usually goes with them. That is the material Ozette had been holding. Part of the village, not a whole frozen town, but part of it, sealed under mud with its most perishable, most ordinary things intact. Now go back to the winter the story reopens. 1969 into 1970. A storm works the coast, and the bank at Ozette begins to slump and erode. That erosion is doing two things at once, and you have to hold both. It is the reason anyone sees the buried deposit at all. The sea is peeling back the cover and showing what the clay had kept, and it is a threat. The same water that exposes the wood can carry it away. Once perishable material like this comes out of its wet, sealed layer, the clock that had been stopped for centuries starts running again. Every tide can take a little more. This is where the pressure of the whole story sits, and it is quiet pressure, not spectacle. There is no villain here. The antagonist is time itself, and decay, and the plain physics of a coastline eating a bank. What had been safe underground was suddenly at the surface, fragile, and on a deadline no one chose. Leave it alone, and the coast keeps taking it. Dig it out carelessly, and you destroy the very thing that makes it rare. The bank had opened a window. The window would not stay open. So, a decision had to be made, and the record is clear about who made it. After the exposure, the Makah Tribal Council invited the archaeologist Richard Dougherty to the site. Formal excavation began in April of 1970. Notice the shape of that. This is not the old story of outsiders stumbling on a lost place and carrying it off. The recorded action is a decision by the tribe, an invitation on their ground about their past, and the work that followed was not done at arm's length. Makah elders helped identify the objects coming out of the clay. Younger tribal members worked as excavators, as conservators, in the laboratory. Those are recorded roles, recorded decisions, actions, not motives, and the actions are already enough. The objects coming out of the ground were fragile beyond ordinary handling, and they were coming out of a culture's own memory of the place. Reading them was going to take more than a trowel. It was going to take people who still knew what the objects were for. Here is why that mattered so much, physically. Almost everything organic decays. Wood, fiber, bark, rope, leave them in the ground and, in most places, in a few generations, there is nothing left but a stain in the soil. Bacteria need oxygen to do that work. What happened at Ozette is that the slide sealed the deposit under wet, dense clay, and that waterlogged, low-oxygen layer starved the process that normally erases the soft materials of a life. The rot mechanism simply stalled, so the perishable held. But that same fragility that let it survive underground made it dangerous to recover. This material could not just be dug out. It could not even be allowed to dry because drying could destroy it. So the team used pressurized water, hoses washing the clay away rather than tools cutting through it, keeping the objects wet as they emerged, then moving them, still wet, into conservation. Slow it down for a second and feel the balance. The exact conditions that preserved these things for centuries were the same conditions that made one wrong move fatal. Dig them the ordinary way, or let them dry in the air, and the record that had survived the burial would not survive the rescue. The physics that saved the everyday was also the physics that could erase it in an afternoon. So picture the work itself, built only from what the record actually describes. An eroded bank at the edge of the village site on Cape Alava. Above the old house floors, a heavy layer of clay, the overburden that had sealed everything. And beneath it, coming into the light, worked wood and cedar bark that had no business still existing. The recovery did not look like digging. Water from hoses ran against the clay, loosening it, floating it away, uncovering each object without a blade ever touching it. Whatever emerged went out wet, kept wet, carried to a field laboratory before the air could get to it. And this went on. Not for a season. From 1970 until 1981, 11 years of it. More than 55,000 objects came out of that clay this way, one careful clearing at a time. I want to hold the shape of that against the way we usually imagine discovery. There is no single golden moment here, no lid lifted on a lost world. There is patience, measured against a coastline that would not wait. Every object recovered was one drying mistake, one careless hour away from being lost after all it had survived. The labor was the price. Keeping the record intact meant matching the slowness of centuries with the slowness of hands. So, what did the mud actually keep? This is the part that reorders everything. When the count was done, more than 80% of the recovered material was wood or plant fiber. Not stone tools, not the hard, durable things that usually make up what we dig out of the past. Baskets, cordage, carved wood, mats and boxes and handles. The soft working stuff of daily life, the exact category of thing that time takes first and almost always takes completely. That is the rarity at Ozette. Not that something grand was preserved, but that the ordinary was. The stuff that never gets written down, that lives only in use, that vanishes the moment its people do. Here it had survived, by the pure accident of a slide and the chemistry of wet clay. And that is where survival turned out to be only half of keeping. Because look at what was actually sitting in those conservation trays. Thousands of ordinary objects, physically saved, perfectly real, and silent. A basket that has come through centuries of wet clay is still, on its own, just a shape, a woven thing, a worn handle, a length of cordage, kept, and waiting for someone to say what it had been. You have probably heard Ozette called something bigger. A federal heritage document has used the phrase, a North American Pompeii, and you can feel why the comparison is tempting. But I want to correct it now, cleanly, and then set it down, because the real story does not need it. The sources do not give us a fixed year for the slide. They do not give us a confirmed trigger. There is no casualty count, no scene of people caught mid-motion, no village frozen in a single final instant. It is worth being exact about one point. Some accounts once tied the slide to the Great Cascadia earthquake of 1700, but a peer-reviewed study from 2025 finds the mud flow came at least 19 years after that earthquake. So the neat catastrophe version does not hold. And that is not a loss. Letting go of the frozen moment fantasy is what lets the sharper, truer thing come into focus. Because here is what was actually rare. It was never a moment stopped in time. It was that the perishable ordinary survived at all, and that its survival split into two halves that do not travel together. Say it plainly. The mud kept the object. It could not keep the meaning. A carved piece of wood, a certain weave, a worn handle, physically recovered, chemically intact, and still mute about what it was for, how it was made, where it belonged in a life. That second half, the meaning, had survived, but on an entirely separate line. It survived in living knowledge. Makah elders helped identify the objects as they came out of the ground. The tribe kept the collection on the reservation, and the Makah Cultural and Research Center grew from the work of curating and interpreting it. Keep that claim honest and no bigger than the record allows. This is documented participation and stewardship, not a claim that no one else on Earth could ever have read a single object. But the plain fact stands. The reading and the keeping of this everyday material were done with and by the descendants of the hands that made it. One line of survival was clay, the other was people. And once you see the two lines, look at what the clay could never hand back. We do not know the exact year the slide came down. We do not know its precise trigger, or the sequence of that day, or whether anyone was there when it came. The record is simply silent on those things, and silence here is not a cover-up. It is the honest edge of what a buried layer can tell you. A slope failed centuries ago over part of a village. The wet ground held the ordinary. A storm gave it back. That is what the mud knows, and no more. The rest, what each object was for, how it was made, where it belonged in a day, was never in the clay to begin with. It rode the other line, the one that runs through people, and that line is the one that has to be carried forward by hand. So come back to where we started. The woven cedar bark, saved from rot by an accident of mud, kept legible by the descendants of the hands that first made it. The National Park Service says many of the recovered objects now reside at the Makah Cultural and Research Center in the care of the people whose memory pointed to the place to begin with. That is the whole story, and it is enough. A thing kept but unread is only half saved, and somewhere out there, in a museum drawer or a relative's attic or your own kitchen, there is an object that has already outlived the person who knew it, still waiting on the last one who can say its name. It might be waiting on you.